the one thing I encourage people to think about, whatever it is, whatever it's, if it's strategy, OKRs, or discovery, but whatever your way of working is, what is it supposed to do for you? Like what should be changed through it? And whatever that is, what you define as the success, like achieving that could be your real progress. And I think the difference is you follow the playbook where it's not connected to what you want to achieve with this way of working compared to, I know how I want my organization to change. And I adapt the practice in a way that it supports that.
Hello and welcome to One Night in Product, the show where I chat to some of the brightest minds in product from across the globe to help you see product management in a whole new light. If that sounds up your street, don't forget to dive into the back catalogue on your favourite podcast app or on YouTube, and of course follow, share or drop me a comment or review. It all helps keep the lights on. My guest tonight is Tim Herbig. Tim's a product management coach, author and speaker, just like everyone else seems to be these days, but he's been doing it for longer than most, coaching teams at companies like StepStone, Chrono24, Deutsche Telekom and Specsavers, with the latter presumably helping him in his efforts to get myopic product leaders to focus on their discovery, strategy and OKRs. He's here tonight to talk all about his new book, Real Progress, and no, that's not a Spanish football team, but an essential guide to helping you get away from fixating on processes and making a real difference in your work. Tim, thanks for coming and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
It's a pleasure. I know we've been trying to get this on the agenda for a little bit now, so I'm glad to have the chance to get in and start to pull apart all your ideas. What's the worst that can happen?
Exactly.
But let's talk about those ideas. So you're here, you've got a book. I've had a look. It's called Real Progress, How to Connect the Dots of Product Strategy, OKRs and Discovery. So it's got all the buzzwords all in the same title. But why did we need another book about all this stuff? And most importantly, why were you the person to write it?
That's a really good question. I think the main answer, why am I the person to write it, is that I feel I just had it in me. As in, it felt so obvious that I somehow had to do it. Mostly for my own sanity, and if as a byproduct it would help others even better. The reason I went for that combination is I felt, as you're right, I think there's so many books been written about strategy, OKRs, discovery, and many of them are amazing. And for me, I feel like what I got as a feedback since I went independent is that I like to joke that 50% of all the issues you have with, let's say, OKRs or discovery have nothing to do with OKRs or discovery. They're part of so much other stuff and partially those adjacent domains. And I felt that I got that as a feedback that helped people like look beyond the one framework, the one practice, the one tactic, and calling out these connections in a pragmatic way without putting another template on the table felt like something that I seem to, and I enjoy it. People I work with enjoy it. And I felt like, I've been writing about this for a few years. So why not take on the pain of putting it into a book form?
But that's a lot of pain though, right? Like it's not something that people go into lightly. And I've definitely spoken to a bunch of authors that have been like, that was a lot. I know you wrote one before a few years back for Sense and Respond, but like, what was it that not only made, I know you say that you had it in you, and of course that's maybe if it was just waiting to come out, but like what made you feel that you had the kind of, had it in you, I guess, to kind of commit to that effort and see it through?
Yeah, I think it's two-sided. Like one is that I noticed that over the years, like through the normal writing that I do with the newsletter and LinkedIn stuff, I felt like, okay, there's like so many ideas, so many things there, but it felt like I don't want to go too deep and some things feel too big for a blog post or newsletter. And I had a couple of years ago, I think 2022, I had this idea, I could write a book, but I never got to it. I never could commit to it. I would dabble with the idea. And then I had this pivotal moment in 2023. I was on a cab ride at Product Guitar in Hamburg, and I had shared the cab with Petra Wille, Jeff Gotthelf, and I think Christina Watke. And they three were all going off on the book and their book work and authorship. And I was sitting there like, shit, now I need to write a book. And so 2 weeks later, I talked to the woman I work on with other content as well. And I was like, let's write a book. And she was like, you sure? I was like, yeah, I know what to write about. How hard can it be? And she was like, okay, you good? Mark my words.
My sweet summer child, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And the good thing for me is that there's so many different approaches. You could say like, I'm going to lock myself away for 3 months and write the book. I knew that would not work for me. I wanted to dual track consulting and writing just to bring things back from the book to apply and work to test if does this even make sense. And so it took longer than it could have. And yet I feel there's no part I could have fastened or maybe made it faster in a way. But towards the end, it's like, you have to just get through it.
And then as soon as you release it, you double your prices, the consultant's dream, right? But if you had
I'm
to
not sure.
describe, well, we'll see, fingers crossed. But if you had to describe this book then in a lift or an elevator to a curious product person or potential future reader, what's your elevator pitch in a nutshell?
That's good. I would describe it as a workbook for improving, for tackling any of those nasty real life questions you might have had about discovery, strategy, and OKRs. It's something you can revisit, you can drop in and out of. I imagine it to be a workbook rather than a front to back book. My inspiration was something like Testing Business Ideas from David Blunt, which I think is beautifully done. It's like I want people basically to read it in a way that they say, oh, this is great, let me go do it. And then they might revisit the book weeks later. So that's how I would describe it, this non-linear workbook for the nasty real life questions across these 3 domains.
No, absolutely. And we're obviously going to talk about some of those questions in a minute. But at its heart, the book is, as per the title, around like making real progress. And you call out in the book, quite near the beginning of the book, kind of 2 different types of progress. You call out alibi progress and you call out real progress. So before we get to real progress, how are you defining alibi progress?
The way I would describe it is both of my own behavior earlier in my career and the work I did with companies is to worry more about the right way of implementing a practice or way of working rather than does it even make sense or add value to what I have to do, what I have to achieve right now. That's how I would characterize alibi progress.
Well, it's funny because you just mentioned like going back to your career, and in the intro to the book, you talk about going back to an old boss, asking the boss for feedback on how you were back in the day, maybe even expecting that feedback to be quite good, getting told there was loads of outputs, no outcomes, that you just sat there hiding behind methods and tools. So it's kind of a pretty brutal bit of feedback, kind of a kick in the pants. And I'm sure that didn't feel great and maybe even helped inspire the book. But do you think that most product teams are kind of in that situation, as you kind of described it, alibi progress, not really making big differences, and if they went back to their bosses, they'd get pretty much the same feedback? Like, is that a very common thing that you see from your work out and about?
I mean, I would say that, of course, there's a certain bias to my answer, as in it's the companies I get to meet who might reach out because they are
selection
not
bias,
happy.
right? Selection.
Exactly. So I would say, yeah, out of those companies I get to meet, that is pretty prominent. I think the question is, I think this leadership reflection is more interesting because that can only come from a person, from a boss who is noticing that and who is not part of the alibi progress trap as well. Because otherwise you might get the feedback, no, you've always done great on the implementation of these methods. You always followed them to the letter. And I think if you get that, you don't see the problem. So I think is there, how willing are you to sacrifice methodology correctness for real life results?
That's an interesting kind of sub point there. You talked about the bosses and the progress that they're making as well. And I guess it's also fair to say that in some organizations, not all, but in some organizations, you might even consider that just about everyone's making some kind of alibi progress as well, right? Because they're not sort of, everyone's kind of doing the things that they do and seeing things through their lens, and maybe it's not all kind of joining up, and it kind of, there's lots of effort, but there's no reward. Like, again, maybe there's some selection bias, as you say, that maybe the types of companies that come and ask someone like you or someone like me to come and help out, maybe have a bit of that, and maybe there's a big bunch of other companies that are completely fine. But do you feel then that this is both kind of a personal and a team issue, as well as actually maybe an entire organizational issue in some of the companies that you've seen?
I would say it's more of for the larger companies that I get to meet, I would say it's definitely more of a company-wide issue, because it stems from a company wanting to go through a certain type of change or adopting a certain practice. And then common approach I see is to trying to boil the ocean all at once and standardize everything across all the teams, which I'm not a big fan of because it leads to this kind of tick box exercise. Then you realize, is leadership comfortable with the lack of control, lack of standardization by rather working in principles rather than saying this is the exact playbook every team has to run through in the exact same way?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of some of the stuff in the Netflix book, No Rules, where they're talking about, like, if you're, I don't know, landing a plane or taking off a plane, then you probably want a checklist of stuff that you can go through to make sure you've done all the things. But if you want kind of invention, if you want divergent thought and stuff like that, then actually the last thing that you want to do is to kind of try and focus in on following a list of things. But it's something that a lot of companies seem to gravitate towards. And as you say, maybe as you get larger as well, because it's kind of seen as the best way to some extent, kind of bring order to chaos, right? Like, how could we possibly, across all these hundreds or thousands of people, make sure that we just somehow culturally work all the same way? So on the one hand, you sit there and say, well, okay, no one particularly wants complete carnage and chaos. On the other hand, no one wants everything to be a complete checkbox exercise. But one argument that I've seen, and in fact I've even sometimes used, is that maybe to some extent, by trying to push people towards maybe some of these frameworks or standardized exercises or frameworks or tick boxes or whatnot, it's a way to kind of kickstart the cultural stuff and start to kickstart them asking the right types of questions and having the right kind of attitude versus just kind of leaving them to it. Like, is there any benefit to trying to over-egg it and then pulling back, or do you feel that when you over-egg it, then maybe they stay over-egged?
I think I would agree in the fact that I think there's a certain value in when you start to wanting to implement something new in the company that like just focus on the number of reps that people put in. I think there's a lot of value in that. It's like one company I once was a part of, the user research team had the mandate to upskill user interviews across product management. One thing they did was they hosted a competition of saying the product manager with the most interviews this quarter gets like a little prize or something. And of course, you can't say every interview, like it's not quantity equals quality, but it's impossible to not do 30 interviews and to not get better at it. And I think do you understand that the type of work that you're doing matches the stage you're in? Like as you said, I want to kickstart a practice. I'm just going to have people do something very intensively for a few days or weeks or maybe a quarter. But then I need to make sure that this is not the default way of measuring success and using these vanity metrics. And I think that's this balance of like, because if progress in the beginning means I want people to get better at that, then the number of reps might be the right technique. If you would then want to say, okay, progress means people pick the right method appropriately and spend the right amount of time on it, it might not longer be the right measure of success.
No, absolutely. Well, let's talk about that progress then and some of the things that people can do to make it. And you talk in the book about real progress as opposed to alibi progress. This idea that, moving away from how you've just described it, like prioritizing correctness of practices and actually moving towards creating value in a specific context. So I guess one question, actually, while I think about that, is that making real progress sounds quite hard, like depending on the company and the things that may be pushing you forward and holding you back.
Yeah.
And sometimes product managers maybe even seem to secretly quite enjoy, to some extent, or maybe enjoy the certainty of having, say, for example, leadership tell them what to do. And it's just their job to complain about being told what to do, but then they can just get down to doing the day-to-day practices that they actually sneakily enjoy. There's a craft to making software. There's a craft to getting stuff delivered. Do you feel that that's a common kind of, I don't like to use the cliche of anti-pattern, but something that happens in product teams where actually changing this stuff is really hard, and there is a certain joy of just doubling down on the craft?
I'd agree. I think I would agree in the sense that I definitely agree with the part of like that the joy in doubling down on the craft, but I think that requires I think that's a very idealistic idea of saying like you need someone with intrinsic motivation to improve their way of working. Because I mean, there's this famous Reddit post, right, where someone says, "I stopped doing product management and I'm a happier person."
Yeah, well, I can certainly imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's I mean, at the end, we're all humans, right? I mean, I get the point. Like you give away a bit of accountability, a bit of responsibility. You follow the guide, you follow the playbook. Someone else is to blame, and you do your work. I mean, I think there's this great quote I once heard that show me the incentive, I show you the outcome. And so the question is, what is a person incentivized by? And understanding that, and if you're incentivized by the best work-life balance in the world and economic security and a lack of stress at night, then that might be your way of working. And again, if that fulfills you, good for you. Like, who am I to argue with what fulfills people or what incentivizes them? I would say if you have a certain ambition to say, I don't want to complain about what others tell me to do. I don't want to feel like I'm repeating the same checkbox exercises. I don't care. I'm wondering if it does anything for anyone. Then you might want to question things a bit more.
Yeah, I guess it's about, making your own bed and lying in it, right? But when we're
Yeah,
talking then about real progress, I mean, you've defined alibi progress, but
yeah,
how are you defining real progress specifically, like apart from just being the opposite of alibi
yeah.
progress?
Ah, yeah, the good thing is I can retreat to everyone's favorite product management quote, which is "it depends." I think that's
There you go.
how I love to frame it is.
I'm sold.
Yeah, progress is. I mean, progress what it means in your context, and that's what I try. That's kind of the red thread I try to pick up with the book, as in the one thing I encourage people to think about, whatever it is, whatever it's if it's strategy, OKRs, or discovery, but whatever your way of working is, what is it supposed to do for you? Like what should be changed through it? And whatever that is, what you define as the success, like, and achieving that could be your real progress. And I think the difference is you follow the playbook where it's not connected to what you want to achieve with this way of working compared to I know what I want to change, how I want my organization to change. And I adapt the practice in a way that it supports that. So that's how I would describe it. Like that real progress means of adjusting a way of working so that it fits your context and helps you achieve whatever goal you have at a given time.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a point I've made in the past when talking to teams about their own processes. It's like there's nothing wrong with, like, some people are just like they just hate any mention of the word process. From my perspective and how I've tried to frame it is like there's always a de facto process when you build things, right? And obviously you should be as intentional with that as you can.
Yeah.
But it's more about like making sure that the process serves you versus versus you serving the process. Like if you're just doing
Yeah.
it, as you say, as a checkbox exercise or because a book said to do it, then, maybe it's the right thing, maybe it's not, but you should be intentional, right? You shouldn't just be doing it because someone else said to do it or because you used to do it and no one ever changed it. Like I've had enough people that I've worked with or clients that I've worked with that are like, oh yeah, we've just been having this meeting for years. No one even knows why we go into it anymore, but we just keep having it because it was on the calendar. It was a recurring thing. The person
Yeah.
who set it up, they've left by now, but we still keep doing it anyway. No one gets any value out of it. But like, I'm going to go out on a limb and say you've probably seen a bunch of that sort of stuff going on as well when you're out and about.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, whether it's adopting some kind of framework, templates from other people, and suddenly you see how frameworks are being used in a different way, and you are like, that's not what was ever meant to create. Like nowhere near. Like cramming font size 8 on a canvas and using that to replace a 40-page PRD. Like that's not the idea of this canvas. And I think it's just funny to see how like you can't swap the tactics, but if the fundamental approach of we want long requirements documents, just use that as an example, is still there, or leadership wants outputs, not outcomes. The framework, the method won't save you. Like OKRs won't save you. They won't make you do anything different. And I think it's, as you said, I think there's no wrong method or wrong process at all. It's just, I love that you said, the intentionality, the awareness. Like, okay, are we making a decision based on that? Are we all agreeing like that is what we're doing? Okay, then let's do it together. But let's not pretend it's like we validated this thing or something.
Yeah, well, it's always interesting seeing what people make out of these things as well. And certainly you've got some war stories that we could probably share after this. But let's stay on topic and talk then about, like, imagine that you've got a team or a company, but let's say a team that's very much sort of stuck in this alibi progress to start with, doing some of the things that you've described, kind of doubling down on the practices rather than actually adapting them or worrying about the actual progress that they're really trying to make. So you've got those people kind of stuck in the alibi world. And now you've got those people wanting to move over into the real progress world and actually start to make a difference. Now, there are presumably, and I've read the book, so I have a basic idea, but there are presumably some core ideas or principles that you'd expect teams to follow if they were going to try and make that hop. And that does then prompt me to have to ask, is there like a checklist that they can follow to do this thing, or is that sort of too meticulous and templatey?
I don't know. Some people might perceive it that way, but what I got as a feedback from readers often that I have this section that I call the quality checks in the book, which are meant to be a bit of like diagnostic questions. And by no means do we have to use all of them, but what I've gotten from people is that these questions might make them aware of the issues they have with a certain practice. I mean, one of the most common things that I hear is OKRs don't work for us, for example. It's like, okay, what does that mean? Like, what does not work for us mean? It's like, yeah, people stop looking at it. It's like, okay. And then you look at then you can use these kind of reflective questions, just like you and I would do with clients. Like, what is going on? Like, what is the issue? And that's what I'm trying to do with the book is like, I think the value of some of these practices I talk about depends on a certain set of attributes and meeting and some of these attributes can influence how valuable the practice is for a team or not. And I think what I oftentimes see is that people look at these attributes and then they can suddenly see, oh, that's why it's not working. It's not working because none of them are leading indicators, or our strategy is not working because we can't connect it to company strategy. And then you can look at the actual issue. And so I would say I think it's not a checklist. The way I would describe it is, I think the quality checks might allow you to spot the reason why you feel stuck with the practice. And then the book offers you a set of potential practices you could utilize to cure that symptom, so to speak. And then move on.
But it's interesting what you say around kind of asking the questions. And I guess maybe to some extent, that's a big part of the problem, right? Is that people don't always feel comfortable, or they're not allowed, or they never think to answer the questions in the first place. So in a situation where they don't really know what's working or what's not working, other than, obviously, yeah, sure, there's stuff being delivered or there's stuff not being delivered, and they certainly know that, but they don't necessarily go back and look at the constituent parts that led up to that. So is part of the purpose of your book then almost like a call to action to say, look, at the very least, go and look at what you're doing and try and actually identify any sort of roadblocks or blockers? Do you think that even if people just did that would be a start?
I think it definitely would be a start. And I mean, my hope would be that some of the stuff, I would say that most of the stuff that I point out in the book, like none of that is by any means a new invention. I think what I found very often is like to ask a genuinely naive question to people, like genuinely, not to provoke them, just to really understand what is this? And then to say like, look, there are these fantastic things out there that you could utilize to fix that. Like my favorite example is always the sphere of influence idea that I call out in the OKRs chapter. It's like around for ages. But few people seem to connect it to the problems they might be having with something like OKRs or metrics in general. And for many teams I get to meet, it's like a light bulb moment. It's like, oh, my OKRs don't work because I can't influence them. And if you say that, it makes you feel borderline stupid because it's like so obvious. It sounds so obvious, but it's not. It's not. It's just not. Because if you follow the outcomes of an output idea a bit too dogmatically, you consider that the main quality criteria compared to can you influence it, and then that makes you blind for these other options.
No, absolutely. And there's obviously also an argument that OKRs, back from the Google days and stuff, that OKRs worked because of the culture and the kind of how they measured success in the first place, rather than just trying to retrofit them onto a company that just doesn't measure things at all like that. So like you're sitting there and we've all seen them, like the OKRs, and there's 150 of them and they're all kind of output based anyway. So like, per person and per team, and they're different between teams. And the key results are just this thing was delivered or that thing was delivered. And like, you talked about Jeff Gottelf earlier, obviously, and Christina, like they've both obviously done tremendous work in this area. They both passionately talk about like the what a good OKR or a bad OKR looks like, and like what a good organization that's using them would look like as well, and some of the kind of OKR crimes out there. And again, maybe we could talk about those in a bit. But I do think that when you're talking about real progress, you're talking about, I think, two core ideas. You're talking about value over correctness? So, making sure that the practice, we talked about already, the practice delivers in the context that you're in rather than some idealistic version, not just trying to be right for the sake of being right. And then also integration over isolation. So this idea that you're doing a bunch of things that kind of support each other versus just a bunch of disconnected things that are going off in different directions. Do you feel that those are both kind of like that you have to do, get both of those right? Can you start with one? Can you start with the other? Can you start to adjust some of the practices and then integrate them later? Or is it more important to integrate them first and then fix for your context? Like, how does that work from a kind of again, I don't want to get too dogmatic about it, but like when you're looking at that as an approach, like what is it that you'd kind of look at and say, if they don't have any of these things, this is where we start.
Yeah. My favorite starting point, and I think that the quote unquote problem is that, I had the same question when I wrote the book. Like, what's the main angle? Is the main angle this contextual improvement of the practices, or is it the connection between them? And I went for both. In the end, of course, you have much more weight on the contextual practices than the connection in the book. I think the easiest starting point is an idea that I describe as like treating your way of working like a product, like looking at something, one thing that you're doing, whether it's a meeting you described or a certain adoption of a new workout or product, whatever. And like, okay, why are we doing this? Like, what do we even want to get out of that? We want to transform the company. We want to have a product operating model. Okay, cool. But how does it look like? Like, what does that mean? When is this successful? And that honestly is oftentimes the easiest start, because you realize oftentimes, or companies realize, how unclear that is. It might be clear in the head of one leader. It's not clear to anyone else. And what I think what this brings to the table is that you then can reflect on this way of working publicly. Like, look, we wanted to achieve this by working this way, but we don't. So we have to change it, because it's like you could change the product. And I think that is oftentimes just acknowledging that can get you so much more buy-in from people, and like realizing, okay, it's not just the one-way street playbook someone's implementing, but like, okay, we're actually trying to adapt that. And I think if you set that foundationally, then you should have a much easier time of going into the individual practices and improving them.
Well, no product book is complete without some kind of canvas or template or framework. And you've got a wheel. So stepping directly onto Petra's territory, you talked about Petra Villa earlier, but obviously she's got the PM wheel. You've got the progress wheel, which is detailed in the book and seems to aim to fulfill kind of three interconnected or supporting purposes. Is it reducing uncertainty with evidence, saying yes or no, and measuring the progress? But within that, there's loads of inner boxes and arrows and miniature wheels, all of which kind of interlink and kind of go back on each other. So like that all I've looked at it, all makes sense to me. But at a high level, how does the progress wheel help me do all of the things that we're talking about with regards to evidence, saying yes or no, measurement, in ways that I couldn't do before?
Yeah. The idea I would say is, it goes back to this point I made earlier. I think this idea of that 50% of your OKR issues are not OKR issues. They might be rooted in whether it's culture, as you said, or something else. And I found what I try to put on the progress wheel is the evergreen greatest hits questions people have when I ask them why they're not satisfied with their strategy or their OKRs. And I think, again, just calling out some potential obvious connections is like, okay, if you don't feel like you can execute your strategy, like, have you ensured that people understand it? Like, have you communicated it? And can you quantify what it looks like to execute it? Which is, spoiler, kind of the main goal of something like OKRs or any metric system. And it's this kind of idea of like trying to point out the seemingly obvious as like, look, why don't you look there? Like, don't try another strategy template, or don't try to redo the strategy. Just go to the basic of, can people understand what it is, and can you measure the success of it? Or when you're overwhelmed with discovery opportunities, what is the biggest risk from the strategic perspective? And like, use that as a lens to prioritize all these different angles and customer problems you might have. So that's the idea, to point to existing anchors, like stuff that is probably already there for people to help them get a bit unstuck, compared to trying to strategize harder and resolve it like that.
Well, I think some people would be best served by strategizing at all. But like, I'm just looking at the progress wheel now, just to sort of look at some of those examples. So maybe I'll put it on the video or something as well. But you've got, for example, if their OKRs are generic and not clearly prioritized, then your action is to revisit the strategy. If you're struggling to measure if your strategy is working, then your arrow or your action point is revisiting the OKRs. And you've kind of got this loop of discovery to OKRs to strategy, kind of in a circle. You've got, if you don't have clear priority for discovery questions, then you can go and see how measuring success is defined, and then use that. So there's like lots of kind of feedback loops and kind of, as you say, kind of questions to ask, and then things that you could maybe do to answer those questions. But it kind of feels though that if I were to, certainly I could look at this and say, okay, fine, let's start to try and dig into this, some of this stuff. But if I were to, for example, print this out and show it to a non-product stakeholder, CEO, or someone from the sales team or something like that, it kind of feels like they might look at this and think this is all a bit kind of fluffy and academic and they just want results, god damn it. Now, we all know where that kind of mentality comes from, but I guess an interesting question based on some of the types of companies I guess we've both worked for or with is how to make this real for maybe stakeholders that would look at anything like this with, at best, suspicion, because they're like, well, this just looks like another framework. And actually make this or translate this into something that you can start to take action with, not just within your team, but also across the organization.
Right. The way I describe it is, like if you take something like discovery, for example, as a practice, and I think there's so much pushback in so many organizations I get to meet, you get like the idea of discovery. And I think the best recommendation I give to teams who face that is, it's borrowing from a product manager I was able to coach once, and she worked in a very business-centric company, and she was like, I sell discovery as a way to protect the company's investment. And I love that because it's a bit unromantic, and every like dear hardcore user problem focused person would scream in anger. But I think that if that's the language of the company, use that, right, to get what you want. Like there's the saying, give people what they want so you can give them what they need. And I feel to me, if you just translate some of these practices into generic language, if you explain to a salesperson, like every product team is an investment of X thousand euros a year, and we want to make sure that we don't put that investment to stuff nobody uses because that amps up the cost and doesn't bring us anything. Aren't you interested in that we work on stuff that does not just burn money, but also might gain the company's money? And these practices are a pretty good idea of improving our chances that we build something that does not just cost money. And I feel if you put it like that, who in their right mind would say no to that? I think if people say no to that, you have another problem.
I can think of a couple of people, but yeah, maybe you're right. But when we're then talking about the relationships between, we touched on it earlier, some kind of fairly classic product topics, OKRs, strategy, discovery, like these are individual topics that, as we've discussed, have been kind of done to death over the years, countless books and articles, even episodes of this podcast. Now, obviously, you've talked about the linkages and the kind of the pathways, but do you have a fundamentally different take on the specifics of, for example, what makes up a strategy or discovery or OKRs, or are you basically just working on the connections, but the kind of the concepts themselves are fairly timeless?
I would say I would not say I have a completely different take than what is out there. For me, it is about pointing out the connections and maybe tweaking some of the great stuff that is out there to the language or the context of the companies that I have gotten to meet. Like my favorite example is, they're great strategy books, like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, How to Win, etc., etc. But what I find oftentimes in companies I get to work at is that these are very good for company strategy, right? Articulating it for one product in a larger company, that they don't really click that way. And that is one example. Or taking OKRs beyond all the basic stuff, all the fundamentals, and really focusing on how to get to better metrics. And then you can populate them into your OKRs. It's not about the OKR system. That's what I would say. I don't think I take fundamentally different stances in there. I think I sprinkle a bit of, or I like to think that I sprinkle a bit of pragmatism and realism in there, and point out the obvious connections.
All right, well, let's get specific then. So strategy is obviously one of the three areas that you talk about, and it's one of, as you say, one of those things that's there's a lot of great literature about it. There's a lot of people writing about what strategy is, what strategy isn't, what good strategy is, what bad strategy is, and so forth. I think it's an area as well where, product managers and certainly product leaders like to think that that's really where they want to play, even though in many cases it kind of feels like they're not, either because they either don't have the capabilities or they're being held back within their organization. But you talk in the book around how, there are kind of three attributes that you need to make specifically product strategy work. So I'm going to test you now and see if you can remember what those three attributes are. And
can I reach for the book? Can I cheat?
No, you have to you have to do it from your head or get it from your teleprompter or whatever. But yeah, so what they are, but also why they're important.
Yeah. So the first one is the strategy decisive? I think I love this quote from Roger Martin who says, let's see if I can get this together. If the opposite of your strategy if the opposite of your strategy is stupid on its face, you've not made a real choice.
Yep.
I love that. Like, I love the simplicity of that. And I think that's what I try to express with being decisive is, does your strategy express something people can disagree with, and where the opposite would be a legitimate option? It's like, don't just say, we win by having a great user interface. Yeah, no shit. No one would say we win through a terrible user interface, other than maybe some, I don't know, what product. There are probably products that bet on that idea.
Yeah, I've seen a couple.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's the one idea. The second one is, how layered is it? And that's this topic I mentioned earlier. Like, do you recognize what you can borrow from the company strategy already and just run with that within these parameters, trying to reinvent the wheel, pun intended? I think there's this great, there's this quote from product manager Thomas at Personio. It's a hugely successful HR tech company, and they actively encourage people to leverage the evergreen benefits the company already has to differentiate new products they're launching. And I love that. Like, you might not love everything the company has, but use it and leverage it for the way you work. And the third one is the topic we touched on earlier. How executable is it? Like, can you implement these choices? You made the choices, you made sure they align with the company strategy. How do you know they work? And to course correct, which is obviously this bridging into communication and translating them into metrics.
But one crucial point there with the kind of middle attribute, whether you can kind of connect your product strategy to the company strategy, is, let's not just bang the drum too much, but there do seem to be a surprising number of companies that don't have a particularly strong or indeed any company strategy to speak of. Now, of course, you can then argue and kind of go back and forth around, well, any company has a de facto strategy, even if it's not a very good one. But at the same time, like, from a practical perspective, if you're sitting there saying, hey, I'm a product leader, product team, I want to make a defensible product strategy that supports the company strategy, but there is no company strategy to speak of. How much of the job then or how much is it then the job of the product manager, or specifically the product leaders, to try to help to inform or create a strategy versus for the company, versus just getting, frankly, really, really good at executing whatever comes up? Because without one, they can't have the other.
Yeah. So I think quite a few people from reading gave me feedback that needs to be acknowledged. And I think that made me add like a paragraph of like, disclaimer, this assumes you have a company strategy. Exactly. It's like a garbage in, garbage out in a way. And I feel, I don't know, maybe it's pragmatic, but I would say like change it, love it, or leave it. As in, like, either you just say, look, that's not how I want to operate. I want a better company strategy. I want more clarity. I don't get that here. I might move on. Like, love it could be, okay, I have to accept it. I accept these parameters. That's, as you said, every company has a strategy, no matter how intangible or fluffy it might be, but something probably exists. And I would even say the good thing is, if it's not as specific, you might have a better case for making more quote unquote bottom up specific suggestions. So maybe I think that could even give you some wiggle room. But of course, the big art is probably changing it. Not sure how realistic that is, quite frankly, in large companies, that you can really like enforce strategic company decisiveness through product strategy. I don't know. But I think what the potential that I've seen, that people just put together product strategy and can present that back and like, is this what you want? And then you can at least force a clear yes or no. So I mean, the more decisive you are in your strategy, your product strategy, you can enforce the yes or the no.
Yeah, well, for the small amount of time before it ends up getting changes again. But I know what you mean. And for me, I also think it's important to kind of come up with scenarios as well. Like, what's going to happen if we do this? What's going to happen if we do this? What's going to happen if we do this? This is the one that we recommend, but like, these are the other alternative futures that you could go after. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting kind of this idea of like trying to almost force strategic thinking, which in a way sounds kind of almost arrogant in a way, like that these kind of clever product managers are going to come in and somehow change the mindset or the thinking, or, make a strategy come from nowhere, from where there wasn't one in the first place. And I guess there's that kind of risk as well, that product people aren't seen as this kind of, wannabe strategists that are kind of maybe operating this like bubble, versus actually, kind of getting with the program and, like you say, sort of love it, leave it, or change it. But it does feel to me that that is the risk of trying to be strategic when maybe those above and around you, maybe you don't feel that they are being, that maybe you are starting to sound a little bit like you're the kind of the arrogant, oh, hey, look how clever I am. Like, is there a risk of that?
I think there is. If you're trying to take yourself and that too serious, I think I once read this great idea, like be sincere but not serious. So I think if you take this, I think this goes a bit into the plays into that topic of like how dogmatic are you about this way of working? And I think I love that you mentioned like I think it's more about strategic thinking than the strategy. And I think by trying to always come up with the strategy, you might get bored faces and people feel like you're lecturing them compared to, well, what are the essentials of strategic thinking? Again, it could just be, hey, can we just like be more decisive in a bit? And provoking that might just be enough to give you, again, what you might want from strategy without going through the whole process and oversizing it too much.
No, absolutely. Yeah, right size and move forward. But talk about then OKRs, which is another element of the wheel. You talked about it, you touched on it earlier as well, the importance of spheres of influence and kind of working on what you can influence versus stuff that you can just contribute to. So I think you talk about kind of areas of contribution and spheres of influence and zones of control. Now, obviously, yeah, we've touched a bunch of times already about some of the problems with OKRs, but like, what do you see as being like the big problems with teams and their OKRs in the kind of the context of that model of like people operating in those different zones or spheres?
I think the biggest pattern that I'm seeing is that you have this top-down, bottom-up conflict, like so many things. It's like management or leadership wants to measure the team against metrics that matter to them, which is ARR, EBITDA, whatever it is, which is from a product team's perspective, really just something they can contribute to because it depends on a gazillion factors, internal teams, other teams, market conditions, etc. So it doesn't really work, right? So they might they might attach that metric to the team, but nothing the team does can be really connected to moving that metric, and then they are labeled as unsuccessful. Compared to the team who might see, okay, I know what I can influence, I know what kind of customer behavior I can influence. I think that's important to acknowledge. You can only influence customer behavior, you can't control it, even though some of us might wish they could. But then the task on the team is, okay, if I know that that's what I can influence, how do I prove or at least point out to the company leadership how it's contributing to those metrics they care about? But there has to be this agreement on this handover moment of like the company saying, we want you to focus on this company metric, and the product, like, please figure out the best leverage point you have to improve. And the team needs to say, we believe this is the best leverage influenceable thing we have based on that kind of evidence. And here's how we think it contributes to the company goal. And then there has to be this agreement of this neutral zone, so to speak. And I would say that's the most common issue for, again, whether it's OKRs or not, any kind of team-based metrics, measures of success, the lack of influenceability on the metric and trying to move a metric that is so far out of reach.
Is there though, I mean, you talked about trying to connect the two, but is there a risk that people almost try then to almost locally optimize for things that maybe aren't really that important just because they are within their realm of control? Yeah. Like whether or not they try to somehow connect that, like sometimes those can be quite difficult to connect. So is it always possible? Do you think that sometimes it makes sense to locally optimize and hope? Like, how can you try and bridge that gap so that you're not, you're talking about making real progress, right? So yeah. If you're kind of just controlling the things that are within your direct zone of control, sometimes it might be a bit of a leap. And this is maybe slight tangent, but something that you see a lot with, for example, very sales-driven products where you're sitting there saying, well, the product team can do all of these things to drive up usage and quality and functionality, etc. But the sales team still have to go out and sell it. And if they don't, then it doesn't really matter what the product team do. Now that's obviously a bit of an us and them type of mentality. Yeah. It's not quite that simple. But there's certainly something to the fact that, like the product team can't always succeed on their own. And is there some maybe chance of like locally optimizing when actually you should be trying to almost force your way into being able to influence bigger things?
The risk is certainly there. And I think I would say from what I've heard from teams, I think it's just like you said before, it's like this topic of intentionality is, do I want to harvest that benefit of using a more influenceable metric, which is easier to measure, more leading maybe, but I trade off a bit of that 100% certainty that you might get from if the EBITDA moves, the company is more financially more secure. And I think it's again, it's a conscious decision. Like, do I want to take that trade-off for a more useful metric for the team? And I take that into consideration. And honestly, I would say even the companies that I've met that are more mature from an analytics perspective, you have to bet a lot on correlation at some point. And it's like finding the signals for just enough correlation to believe in that this metric the team can influence actually links up to the company. Because again, like the big company metrics, they're the aggregate of so many factors that's like moving the tanker. And I think it's like the more informed you are about which metric you can influence to have enough insight or confidence, conviction on it, that improving it should benefit the company goals.
How many different teams have crashed against the rocks of should? But no, I take the point. But one of the things that also stuck out, and we again touched on it earlier, this idea that discovery is a common problem, or lack of discovery is a common problem within many organizations. And one of the things that you call out in the book, which kind of caught my eye, is this idea that sometimes, if you're in a good old-fashioned feature factory and you're given a bunch of solutions or kind of very specific outputs that you need to build, that obviously a lot of the times people just kind of complain about that and, gnash their teeth and then probably just build it anyway. But you recommend something that to some extent I always recommend, which is this idea almost reverse mapping the solution. So you've got a solution and you want to kind of work backwards a little bit. Now, some people might sit there and say, well, that sounds like a bit of a waste of time because we've got to build the thing anyway, right? So why don't we just concentrate on building it? But why don't you talk me through just quickly this kind of reverse mapping idea and why that's beneficial, even if you have been given an output to work on?
I think it's beneficial for two reasons. It depends a bit on the, let's say, the willingness to change of the company. I think the most immediate benefit you can get is to say, okay, if I reverse engineer the customer behavior, the outcome I want to drive with this output, I think there are two conversations you can have. Like, you can at least question, okay, is that even the outcome we want to have? And do we know if that's an outcome that even exists? So you can, like, in a way, pressure test if that problem is real. Should you be open for it? The other angle is, once you can name the outcome, you at least have the chance of defining better success metrics for measuring that output, other than is it shipped or not, right? Because then you can say, okay, that's the customer behavior. Which one or two metrics would tell me that this behavior has changed? So at least it gives you context to evaluate, or a chance to evaluate the output differently. I think, and of course, the so to speak, the Champions League answer would be, okay, if you have the outcome and you might even know that the outcome is real, are you then even open to discussing other outputs to say, oh, maybe another output might be better, or maybe we don't need an output because John in marketing is already building something that does pretty much that. And again, you could go back to the point like, oh, we saved a lot of money by not doing that. Shouldn't that be great? Other than people being dissatisfied that their feature idea was not put on the roadmap. But
yeah, I guess, to your point, it kind of opens up future opportunities, even if you're still having to build the thing in the first place, right? Because like one of the things that I see often is, rightly or wrongly, and let's say wrongly for the sake of this discussion, but that, someone's been given something to build with very sort of flimsy evidence, but at the same time, it's almost like gone too far for them to then just sort of sit there and go, oh, hey, what do you really want? Like, people want a 6-inch hole, not a drill, and all of that. There's definitely a time for these discussions, but sometimes I think I put this on LinkedIn a while ago. Like, sometimes your best job is to kind of line up the next shot rather than try and stop the ball that's already rolling. But and by doing some of the things that you sort of advocated for there, you can kind of make sure that you've got enough evidence to line up the next shot properly, right? Rather than kind of getting to the end of whatever you're building and then just building the next thing, which I guess is the situation that many people get themselves into.
Agreed.
Now, in the book, you say that frameworks should be treated as starting points, not destinations. Now, I believe that. I know you believe that because you wrote it. But also, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, right? So does this mean that your progress wheel is itself a starting point and not a destination?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would kind of be disappointed if people would stop at that.
But do you think that even if they did stop at that would still be more beneficial than not having started? I mean, you wrote the book, so I guess you would say yes, but like, is there even benefits in, just to our earlier point around kind of starting to systematize thinking? Even if they just did that, internalized it and stopped and then carried on doing something else, would that still be beneficial?
I think it would be. I think part of the idea in the book is that I think you can improve your practice but through so many small steps, right? I think if just the example you mentioned earlier, if just one team would realize, oh, our OKRs suck, not because we suck at OKRs, but because the strategy is not clear, that's a win to me. And if you stop at that, cool, then at least you stop this nasty OKR value discussion and turn to the real root cause.
But I'm assuming that you're using this circle in client engagements, for example. So what are some of the maybe natural next steps that you do see people kind of taking after they've sort of, covered the fundamentals? Like, are there any obvious kind of next phases that people go for? Or is it so kind of dependent on the context that it's kind of impossible to give an example?
Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult, or I would say it's so nonlinear and so unpredictable, because to use that OKRs and strategy example, you might realize that, you might return to your strategy, and then you realize all these issues you might have with creating strategic clarity or strategic thinking. And like, who knows where that path might lead you? It might lead you to a different approach to strategy, to reorg, to a different, whatever it might be. So it might not always linearly lead you back to OKRs or even discovery. And I think that's what I had in mind when I said earlier with the book, is like, you might read a few pages and you realize, oh, that's an interesting thing. And you might be busy days, weeks, months with trying that stuff out before you then might return to it. That's my hope, at least.
Well, fingers crossed. But it's funny because I often, when discussing a book with someone, I'll be like, well, what's the first best next step? Like, what's the first thing that someone could do or should do other than buy the book to, start down this path? And obviously, there's another "it depends" coming, I'm sure, but kind of feels like from what you've described, and be curious to get your take, is like that question asking kind of reflection thing that you talked about, kind of trying to understand where your weakest point is, and then sort of jumping to the part of the book that then kind of helps them to answer that question, or the part of the circle that helps them to answer that question, and then kind of looping back once they've made enough progress in that. Is that kind of how you're seeing it, rather than there being like an ideal first, let's start with strategy, or let's start with discovery, or whatever?
I would say that's definitely one starting point. The other one is, I would say, pick whatever practice you're most frustrated with at your company and try to clearly articulate, why are we doing this? What problem is this supposed to solve for whom in the company? And I'm sure from there you will discover many, many opportunities for changing the way you work, and you might even use some of the things lined up in the book.
Again, fingers crossed. Well, as for the book, I mean, it's out. You're on podcasts promoting it, and you're writing stuff about it and trying to get people to read it. But what's next for you now that that's done? Like, do you just sort of get the kit back and relax? You've got big plans for the rest of the year? Have you're going on a big tour? Like, what's next for you with regards to the book or after the book?
For me right now, it's continuing to serve the existing clients that I have with whatever they need and deserve. It is about continuously spreading the word of the book. And for me, it's interesting. I would measure it more about, do the right people read it rather than how many people read it, because I had a specific ICP, as they say, in mind for writing the book. And I'm hoping to nurture that bit, that the right people get it. Also might enjoy some of the fun from appearing at some of the meetups and just being face to face with people who read the book. And other than that, then it's about, okay, how do what might be a few other topics to look into? How do I bring the core ideas of strategy, OKRs, discovery to a new angle? Maybe I'm very, very intrigued by the broader theme of internal product teams. That's something I want to explore more. I think it's super underappreciated, underserved, and it's a common pattern across all my clients. Like product thinking or product practices for internal product teams, something that I feel pretty strongly about. I want to explore more in the future.
Well, there's always another book on the horizon as well, right? Like,
I think Melissa Perry once said it, like, you only commit to the second book once you've forgotten the pain of the previous one. And so I feel the scar tissue is not healed yet for me. So it's not, I would say it's not on the horizon.
Yeah, no, I definitely have heard that from a few authors. It's almost like it's like having children. Like, no one wants to go through labor again, but then, they start thinking maybe they can have another baby. So Yeah, we'll see. I'll watch this space. But if people want to come and find you after this, connect up, catch up, talk about anything they've heard on the podcast, or maybe tap you up for a signed copy of the book, where can they come and find you?
The most straightforward way is probably LinkedIn. Just search for Tim Herbig, or through my website, herbig.co.
I couldn't get the .com, eh?
It's like 15 grand, so I'm saving up for it.
That just shows the value of your ideas, right? That just shows the value of your ideas.
I'm very curious, though, about the person who has that domain and what value they see in it.
Well, spoiler alert, it's me. No, it's not me. But hopefully one day, if you sell enough copy of the books, you'll be fine. But I'll make sure to link all of that into the show notes. Hopefully you get some people making progress into your general direction. Well, Tim, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Some important topics that bedevil many product managers out there. So hopefully we can stop them getting bad feedback in the future when they ask their manager for a review from the past. Obviously, best of luck and success with the book, and we'll keep in touch. But as for now, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Jason.